So let's just begin by talking a bit about what national security means today. The old conception of national security was solely focused on the protection of territorial integrity and national sovereignty by military means. That was the old concept of national security. So national security simply meant the absence of external or internal conflicts. So long as we were safe in terms of our physical security, that was sufficient for national security. But today, the field of national security scholarship has gone well beyond that, so that the idea of human security has taken center stage as a more holistic interpretation of the state's sovereign responsibility to guarantee the safety and well-being of its citizenry. As noted in the United Nations General Assembly Resolution, Resolution 66/290, and it says that human security is an approach to assist member states in identifying and addressing widespread and cross-cutting challenges to the survival, to the livelihood, and dignity of their people. So it calls for a people-oriented, comprehensive, context-specific, and prevention-oriented response that strengthens the protection and empowerment of all people. So the very concept of national security now, at the heart of it, is human security. All of the issues around human security, around security of the individual. Our Constitution, the 1999 Constitution, also recognizes the principle of human security in the fundamental objectives and directive principles of state policy. And it says, and I quote, "The security and welfare of the people shall be the primary purpose of government." The security and welfare of the people shall be the primary purpose of government. So today, human security is national security. And we can't define national security outside of human security. So human security goes beyond absence of war and conflict, but it now goes to the availability of the means to live: food, shelter, and livelihood. Food, shelter, clothing, and other means of livelihood. So clearly, the economy is central to human security because it is the economy that defines those parameters: food, shelter, and clothing. Chief Obafemi Awolowo, who I'm sure many of us are familiar with, one-time Premier of the Western region of Nigeria, preferred a nexus between national development and human development. And we would understand that in today's context as a principle of human security. And he argued, he said, man is therefore the prime mover in every economy. Without him, nothing at all can be produced. He is the determinant of all economic and social change and the generator of all impulses of progress. Above all, he is at one and the same time the initiator, the innovator, the accelerator, the prime mover, the producer, the distributor, the exchanger, and the consumer in every economy. So it should be crystal clear now to you and me, and it goes on, that when we speak of underdevelopment of an economy, we're in effect speaking of the underdevelopment of man. The characteristics of underdevelopment, Chief Obafemi Awolowo wrote and continued to say, those characteristics are entirely and inseparably human. So whenever we talk about human development, whenever we talk about human security, which of course is essentially the same as human development, we're actually talking about the well-being of the individual, each and every individual. So man is central to the economy. If anything makes it difficult or impossible for him to function, the economy is weak and the whole progress of community or a nation is stalled. So the national security community has also embraced that paradigm. And it's a new paradigm, as I pointed out, from a traditional state-centric focus to a more comprehensive orientation towards human security. So Nigeria's national security strategy now states that national security is inextricably linked with and is inseparable from economic security. That national security is inextricably linked with economic security. We recognize, this is what the policy says, it says we recognize that Nigeria's greatest resource is its people, and that the truest measure of our progress lies in the degree to which these people have access to opportunities for empowerment and self-actualization. Consequently, we will promote free enterprise, inclusive economic growth, and continue to aggressively pursue the diversification of the economy with emphasis on developing our human capital. End of quote. So there is a consensus, even in the security community, that human capital is at the very center of national security, and of course at the very center of the national economy. So when we're talking about the national economy, we're actually talking about one and the same thing, because we're talking about human security and human development, the development of the individual, his capacity to contribute to first of all, to his own well-being, and then his capacity to contribute to the well-being of society. So all of that is encapsulated in what we describe as today as national security. So there is no question of national security outside of the security of the individuals. So having laid the theoretical foundations for what will be our inputs, we can proceed forward by noting, amongst other things, that Nigeria is currently the 7th most populous nation on the face of the earth, with an estimated population of somewhere about 200 million people. In 30 years, we will be the world's 3rd most populous country, after China and India. Nigeria is also a very young country. There are 90 million Nigerians under the age of 30, who, of course, as you know, require education, jobs, healthcare, and social infrastructure. To put this figure in perspective, if the population of the young people alone were imagined as a country of its own, then it will be Africa's 2nd most populous nation. If just our young people alone were taken out, that will be Africa's 2nd most populous nation, just to give you a sense of size. And I'm going to keep making some comparisons with African countries in particular, just so that we get a sense of the perspective of the enormity of the challenges that we're dealing with and what the solutions may be. The main policy challenge which we have will be to shape our national security calculus, both now and in the future, to that of creating social and economic opportunity on a scale that not only matches our population growth rate, but also the aspirations of our people, especially the young people. The sole objective of man is to live. To live, he needs food, shelter, and clothing. To do so, he must have the means to earn enough. Where the means are unavailable, his natural instinct is to survive. And of course, that brings about desperation and alienation from society, which makes him potentially a risk to the community, as he must then devise ways to survive or to react against a system that he feels has dehumanized him and or her, as the case may be, by depriving him or her of the means of livelihood. This is why the presence of a large number of young, unemployed, working age population is a threat to national security. The correlation between high levels of unemployment and poverty and crime and conflict have been exhaustively documented, and I don't need to go to any sorts of references. In the context of a large, multi-ethnic and multi-religious nation, the availability of a young population that is not productively engaged provides fodder for extremists, for demagogues, and a host of hostile non-state actors. So it is clear that our current security challenges are both a cause and a consequence of socioeconomic conditions. And I say a cause, not the only cause, but a cause, a central cause. Improving human capital development, especially education, and providing more opportunities for earning a living will reduce the number of young persons available for recruitment into the ranks of Boko Haram and ISWAP and terrorists of that nature, In the Northeast, there are bandits and other criminals around the country. But the insurgency, banditry, and other crimes are also harmful to economic activity. Agricultural productivity in the Northeast and even in parts of the Northwest and North Central have been hampered by terrorism and banditry. And if you take a look at some of the figures, you'll see where those places, the sorts of productive levels that they were at before insurgency and after insurgency. And this has, of course, led to a situation where many are out of work because many of them are farmers. So unemployment itself, unemployment is both a cause and consequence of poverty. And the central question for us, I mean the central question for us, and when I say for us, I mean as a government, is how to address the challenges of creating wealth and opportunities, and how we are addressing the problems of poverty and unemployment. And just as I said earlier, have at least twice here at the National Defense College examined the topic, and there I've elaborated considerably about details about the state of the economy then and the steps being taken. So I do not wish to repeat those contributions. So today I will focus on some of the latest actions and policies of government directed at creating an economy capable of providing decent livelihoods for our people. I'll also speak to some of our thoughts and plans going forward. Our economic policies are based on two broad premises. I say broad premises because these are very, very broad indeed. First is that the private sector, and by that I mean the large, medium, and small scale companies, must be given all the support to create wealth, jobs, and opportunities. So the private sector is key because free enterprise is at the heart of our economic policy. Government must then provide the infrastructure and the enabling environment for this to happen. So I want to just note the very first point, namely that the private sector is at the center. That's large, medium, small scale companies. They are the center of our growth. They must be supported to provide the means by which many of our people will get jobs. But in doing so, government's business is to provide the infrastructure and the enabling environment for this to happen. Secondly, and this is the second premise on which economic policies are based, that before the private sector is able to provide sufficiently for the majority of people, it is the responsibility of government to provide safety nets for the extremely poor, the vulnerable, and those who cannot work. This is the premise upon which our social investment policy is based. So there are two aspects. The first aspect is to say that our economy is to be private sector enabled by government providing infrastructure. The second aspect is that there is still a large number of the poor and the vulnerable who cannot wait for the economy to provide the jobs that it needs to provide. And there, state intervention must play a part. That lower segment, that section of people, the poor, are especially vulnerable to jeopardizing national security. And that's why it's important for government to make adequate provision for that class of people. But I'm just going to talk again, as I said, about the Nigerian economy, and the contributions, the policies that we're undertaking. Very recently, an article featured in the Newsweek magazine was entitled, the article is entitled, "Black China, Africa's first superpower is coming sooner than you think." This was, I think, last week's edition of Newsweek magazine. Africa's first superpower is coming sooner than you think. It was essentially an article of Nigeria and the prospects of Nigeria, and were described as Africa's first superpower, and that we are coming sooner than anybody thinks. I agree entirely. Of course, there are very many aspects of that. It's not necessarily one that praises the Nigerian economy or that good. But at least it points to a very significant fact. The essential point that is made in that article is that despite our challenges, Nigeria is the last open market on earth. And that like China and India, its population and economic size will enable economies of scale and attract international investment just by the sheer size of the market. Just this week, last week now, the Spur Group, an IT company from China, indicated that it would be establishing a computer hardware manufacturing plant in Nigeria. The simple reason, of course, is because they see the market and they see that that potential is huge. Over 147 people have mobile phones or some other device or some other computerized devices. 147 million people. Much earlier than this, in the course of last year, the Mara group of Ashish startup had also indicated that they will set up a manufacturing plant for mobile phones in Nigeria. Microsoft has also indicated that it will build its $100 million Africa Center here in Nigeria. Now, it's not difficult to see why Nigeria remains an attractive destination for investors. Even the insufficient growth, and I want us to note that, of 2.5%, which is our current growth rate, and the growth rate predicted by the IMF for the economy this year, 2020, although our predictions are much better than that. But even that 2.5% growth rate that is predicted comes to about $10 billion US, and is bigger, or just about the size of some of the economies to which Nigeria is sometimes, in my view, erroneously compared. In other words, the scale of the Nigerian economy in African terms is such that our still relatively low growth is much bigger than several other economies on the continent. The point then is that what happens here in Nigeria will fundamentally affect, first of all, our sub-region, and then indeed the rest of Africa. If Nigeria gets onto the kind of economic growth levels that we expect, then it will certainly impact positively the economies of other African countries. It's easy to underemphasize this point, and just to make the point clear, I just want to make a few comparisons, just so that we put this in context. And of course, I'm aware that there are several of you who are also from different African countries, just so as to understand the context of it. So let's take Rwanda, for example. Rwanda is a country whose economy has been growing at about between 6 and 8%. And I believe it's an economy that is quite well run. But Rwanda has a GDP of $8.7 billion as of 2018. The Federal Capital Territory, where you are today, has a GDP of $29.2 billion. This location alone. Akwa Ibom State has a GDP of $14.2 billion. Bayelsa has a GDP of $8.8 billion. Lagos State has a GDP of $90 billion. And the Delta State has a GDP of about $11.2 billion. So there are a number of states in Nigeria whose economies are much larger than the Rwandan economy. 10 states at least. That just gives you a sense of what we're talking about. Lagos State with 90 billion GDP, compared, for example, to Ghana. Ghana has a GDP of 65.5 billion. So Lagos State has a much bigger GDP than Ghana, the whole of Ghana. So that gives us a sense of the size of the economy that we're dealing with, a size of even the challenges, especially in terms of population. So you cannot compare the issues, the economic issues, the socio-economic issues in a country of 200 million with a country of 24 million or 14 million or 5 million. There are huge differences. So I found that in making comparisons, we are also sometimes better off, and this helps us to understand better what to do and how to do it. We're better off looking at countries that have the sorts of challenges and attributes we have in terms of size and diversity. So some of the comparisons that we make in formulating economic policy, we're actually comparing ourselves with India, which of course, as you know, has a huge population, with Brazil, with China. These type of economies with their diversity, especially India with diversity, is the sort of economy that we find ourselves having to compare, both in terms of private sector policy, economic policy for the private sector, as well as social investment, the safety nets that we're providing for people. Another often overlooked point on the part of in the Nigerian story is the large diaspora that we have. Overseas remittances into Nigeria were estimated to be about $25 billion from our diaspora. And this is from formal sources only. Although some students of Nigerian economy will say that it's as high as $40 billion if informal flows are taken into account. So the potential of the Nigerian economy is huge and is being boosted by investments, not just from diaspora investment, because that's a huge investment, investments in agriculture, in manufacturing, in technology, and creative industries. The story of the increased rice production in Nigeria, for example, is well known. We have a production of paddy rice in 2019, which is estimated at about 7.3 million metric tons, compared to about 5 million metric tons in 2015-2016. And it's important to point out that the production of paddy rice, if we were milling at the rate of production, we would be self-sufficient in rice production by now. But milling is behind in terms of that value chain. And we've also worked quite hard on trying to get more investment into milling. Dangote, for example, has invested in about 1,000 milling machines to be located in parts of the northwest and the northeast. And there are several other investors, smaller in milling. I believe very strongly that if we're able to ramp up our milling, we should completely eliminate importation of rice, which at the moment anyway is about 2% of what we used to import. But there's still a fair amount of smuggling, especially before the close of the borders. A little noted phenomenon taking place in agriculture is the use of technology to attract funding into the sector. These programs, and there are up to about 17 of them at the last count, enable a wide variety of people to invest in agriculture without actually owning or having to engage in farming or to manage farms. Now, given the huge investments in agriculture and the relative ease of investing through such platforms, we are bound to see a huge increase in investment in agriculture and subsequent increases in agricultural output across the value chain. And let me just talk very briefly about some of these mechanisms for investing in agriculture. There are a few companies, and these are companies that are technology enabled, formed by young Nigerians. There's a company called Thrive Agric, there's another called Farm Ally, and these are companies essentially that look for funds online from people who are interested in investing in farming. So if you're interested in farming, they will take your funds, guarantee a dividend at the end of a certain cycle. You can choose the farm, the particular location of the farm you want to invest in their own portfolio. And you can then watch the progress of that farm and expect dividends from it. Quite a few, there are about 3 or 4 companies doing that very actively now. And they are now generating billions of naira into the agricultural industry. And these are, as I said, just technology-enabled investment platforms. Of course, in order to enable them, government policy is crucial, which is why we have the payment systems, the new licenses for payment systems that will allow the central bank. The central bank now permits these kinds of payment systems and investment platforms. And we have to be proactive in doing so in order to encourage more platforms to be able to invest in agriculture. If you look today at the Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index, this is just how you get a feel for activities in the manufacturing sector and the outlook for the future. It stood at about 60.8 index points in December of 2019, which was the highest level it has been in about 3 years. So there's obviously an uptick in manufacturing. But perhaps more significant is the fact that all component parts of the index show an uptick. Inventories, employment levels, supply deliveries, new orders, production levels, all of them reported positive growth. Now this might be imperceptible in the overall economy because it's merely a trend, but it's clear that there is far more attention today being paid to manufacturing and processing than ever before. And this is obvious from the figures. So the positive outlook for the manufacturing sector can be seen from, for example, the Leventis Group, which continues to make substantial investments in the manufacturing sector through its subsidiaries, the Nigerian bottling company and Better Glass. Nigerian bottling company, for example, will soon commission its new plant in Ashejire, which has taken a substantial part of a recent $500 million investment in Nigeria. Now, Better Glass, which makes the bottles for the pharmaceutical sector, and for beverages like Coca-Cola and Starbucks, has also invested another $30 million to expand its $30 million, that is, to expand its furnace capacity. The Nigerian technology sector continues to hold out great promise also. Recent reports show that Nigerian startups attracted $122 million out of the $492 million in funding African startups in 2019. But perhaps the more compelling is the increase in the use of e-payment channels within the economy. Multi-billion naira companies founded by Nigerians, most of them under 30, are growing practically every day. And few examples: Paystack, Softcom, Haggard, Farmerline, Kia, Mall of Africa. There are just literally hundreds of them today. All of them turning over large amounts of money, taking a space that used to be unoccupied. A lot of banks, of course, are used to their traditional banking systems. But what a lot of these young men and women are doing is that they're able to transfer large amounts of money quickly and without much charge to various parts of the country and to the unreached parts of the country. Many of them are building platforms. For example, when we started our Empower program, our Empower program is our jobs program for young people, where we've engaged so far 500,000 young men and women under the Empower scheme. Now, to recruit these young men and women, we needed a platform where people would apply, where these young people would apply. And we got a Nigerian company called Softcom, very young people, as I said, who put together this very robust platform. And this is the sort of platform that takes, when the platform is open, almost 4 to 5 million applications. And not just the applications, they process the applications, they conduct the tests on those applications, and then we make payment through those platforms to over 500,000 people, practically everywhere. And the same is true. We also built the platform. These are all local entrepreneurs. Building the platforms for microcredit loans to 2 million traders in Nigeria. These platforms, the payments, the collections, the repayments, all of that are done through those platforms. And they're all, technology platforms built by Nigerians. The value of point-of-sale transactions is reported to have reached 3.2 trillion naira in 2019, as compared to about 2.3 in 2011, an increase of 38%, while the volume also increased by 153 million transactions to a total of 438 transactions in 2019. Now, POS transactions are also a way of knowing what consumers are doing, what's going on, how many transactions are going on, and how many of these transactions, and these are recorded transactions on POS. So with the registration of payment service banks and the increase in the minimum level at which stamp duty is payable, as of course I'm sure you're aware, that stamp duty is payable now on sums in excess of 10,000 naira, 10,000 naira and above. It used to be 1,000, but now stamp duty is only payable from 10,000 naira and above. So we are set to see quantum leaps in the use of electronic transactions with the attendant positive effect on the economy. Our creative industry and tourism are also a source of encouragement about our economic prospects. The quality of such offerings from our film and entertainment industry. Nollywood has films like Wedding Party 2, Chief Daddy, King of Boys. I'm sure all of you guys are far too busy to watch any of these movies. But these are made in Nigeria movies grossing large amounts of money at the box office all over the world, attracting large audiences and reaping huge rewards. In terms of quantity, Nollywood is the second largest film industry in the world, producing about 50 movies a week, second to India.
It is true that the quality of such offerings has improved greatly. So what do these stories tell us? All of these stories about economic activity and all that. They are indicators of the emergence of a post-oil Nigeria in which sustainable prosperity will be hinged on our people's capacity for invention and ingenuity. The definition of Nigeria as a nation that is all about oil is now gradually expiring, because as we see productivity, which is key to any economy, as we see productivity, as we see productive enterprise, as opposed to just rent-seeking or just extraction, we are seeing the growth of a real economy, an economy that can blossom and give the thousands of jobs that are required, in fact, the millions of jobs that are required in our country. Now, one of the major challenges in growing our economy is maintaining an environment favorable to business and the problems of low revenues. I don't want to go into all the litany of complaints about difficulties of doing business in our environment. But I'll probably just come to that very briefly. The other problem is low revenues. In other words, we're generating low revenues as a government. Now, our budget this year is 10.6 trillion. Last year is about 8.9 trillion. That's Naira. The aggregate revenue that is the aggregate of all our revenues, estimated will be about 8.4 trillion, with a shortfall estimated of about 2.2 trillion. So we are not making enough to fund the budget, and that means, of course, that we have to borrow. We have to borrow, especially to fund our capital projects. The sources of our revenues, as you know, are all proceeds and taxes. And the same problem with generating revenue that the national economy has, the states also have. So most states do not generate enough revenue in 1 year to pay their bills in 1 month. So for example, let's just take 2-3 examples. Adamawa State, its IGR, is internally generated revenue, was 6.2 billion, the annual internally generated revenue, which means that it generates about 517 million naira a month. But in 2018, Adamawa's expenditure was about 14.8 billion a month. So they generate 500 million a month, and their budget is 14.8 billion. That is without federal allocation. I'm talking of what they're able to generate. Of course, with federal allocation, that comes to quite a bit. But just in terms of what the states themselves are able to generate. Benue State, for example, its IGR was 11.2 billion in 2018. That's about just over 900 billion, that's just over 900 million a month, 900 million a month. But Benue State's expenditure in a month, it comes to something in the order of about 14.9 billion. So it generates about 900 million, and it spends about 14.9 billion. So you can see the huge gap. Ekiti State, its IGR was about 538 million naira a month. That's what his IGR is. But his expenditure is 8.2 billion a month. So they generate about 500 odd million, but then spend about 8.2 billion. So there's a huge deficit. It shows that both the federal government and the state governments are simply not collecting enough revenue. They're simply not collecting enough revenue. And so these revenues, of course, are badly needed. So let me just talk briefly then about the finance bill, which tries to address some of the concerns that I've mentioned. This finance bill is a new legislation. It's the first of its kind since 1999, and it's government's fiscal response to some of the issues I've mentioned, the twin issues of generating enough revenue and also creating an environment for business to thrive. The Act itself, that's the Finance Act, has two main purposes. The first is that it addresses the issue of domestic revenue mobilization. That's the issue of getting more tax. And Nigeria has often paraded, as I pointed out, an abysmal record. Second, it contributes to improving the ease of doing business in Nigeria. So the two major objectives of the Finance Act, which the President just signed into law a couple of weeks ago, is first, to ensure generation of revenue, and secondly, to create a better environment for doing business in Nigeria. Now, everyone agrees that the engine of commerce in any economy are the small and medium-scale businesses. So for us, one of the most important objectives of the Finance Act are the specific incentives for small businesses. The Act exempts small businesses, small companies. Those are companies with a turnover of less than 25 million naira a year from paying any company's tax at all. So if a company generates, in terms of turnover, less than 25 million naira a year, it pays no taxes at all. It's exempted from taxes. Medium-sized companies with a turnover of between 25 million and 100 million a year will now pay companies' income tax at a lower rate of 20% from the upside of 30%. Now they'll be paying 20%. With these in place, the Finance Act has done away with that whole cumbersome procedure also for computing minimum tax for companies under the company's tax and all of that, and replacing that with a simple base rate of 0.5%. For insurance companies, this is a sector that had complained of lack of growth. There's a bit of good news as well. Before the Act, insurance companies were only allowed to carry forward losses for 4 years, even when companies in other sectors of the economy could carry their losses indefinitely. This anomaly has now been removed. They can now carry their losses forward indefinitely. And there's also the special minimum tax for insurance companies has now been abolished, so that in many senses we expect to see a growth in the insurance industry because they are now to be treated as just any other company. And a lot of the restrictions on their growth have been removed by the Act. To ensure better revenues from dividends, and this is a very important point, because dividends are, of course, a major source of revenue for individuals, a major source of availability of consumer spend. Now, what has happened now is that there are provisions in the Act to mitigate the risk of double taxation of dividends. Before now, dividends that were paid out of retained earnings were liable to tax, despite the fact that such earnings would usually have been subjected to tax already. So there was a double taxation situation ahead of the Finance Act. There's now no longer that. So you can't have a situation where if you retain earnings, your retained earnings are already taxed. Your retained earnings, your profits are already taxed. Today, you cannot, after taxing profit, you are no longer allowed to tax the dividends because it's already been taxed once. So a similar provision has also been made in respect of franked investment income and dividends paid out of exempted profits. In other words, these sources of income will no longer be at the risk of double taxation. And it's very important to bear in mind that these tweaks in policy, these tweaks in fiscal policy are crucial in releasing aspects of the economy that had been either undergrowing or simply not growing at all. Because as far as we're concerned, in order to create the jobs and the job opportunities that we know are necessary, we simply must ensure that the environment for companies to thrive, small companies, medium companies, and large companies, that environment is as friendly as possible. Another business-friendly provision in the Finance Act is the granting of credits to companies for early filing of their tax returns. So if a company files its tax returns early, large companies, if you're a large company, you'll get a 1% tax credit, while medium-sized companies will get a 2% tax credit just for filing their tax returns early. Furthermore, in recognition of the special impetus required for infrastructure development, withholding tax rate on roads, bridges, buildings, and power plant construction contracts is now reduced from 5% to 2.5%. So those who are in infrastructure contracts or who enter into infrastructure contracts, in the past they paid a 5% tax. Today, that has been reduced by the Act to 2.5%, so that infrastructure, building of houses, power, roads, rail, etc., is now much cheaper, and of course brings more profit to those who are involved as contractors. Now let's talk about increasing government revenues. It's already well known, and of course, it's the reason, and I need to just explain this quickly. Of course, you know the reason why government revenues are important is first of all because of infrastructure investment, but also in order to satisfy the second premise of our economy, which is the provision of the social investment program. So government revenues are crucial for two of those reasons. Now, it's a well-known fact that Nigeria's debt to GDP ratio has always been very low. Indeed, is one of the lowest in the world. This has by itself seriously hampered economic growth and limited the delivery of public amenities, and these are essential preconditions for attracting investment. The OECD's revenue statistics in their recent report, the 2019 report, puts Nigeria's tax to GDP as somewhere in the order of about 6%, which, considering the levels of economic activity, is so low as to constitute a negative factor and is a serious drawback for the entire system. This is more so considering that the average tax to GDP ratio across 26 other African countries is 7.2%, which is 11.5% points higher than Nigeria's. So Nigeria has a very, very poor tax to GDP ratio. Another area of revenue improvement, therefore, is in the value-added tax rate. Now, this also has been notoriously low. Our VAT rates is one of the lowest. In fact, it is the lowest in Africa until this recent change. Ghana, for example, has a VAT rate currently of 12.5%. They recently reduced their VAT from 15% to 12.5%. Cameroon has a VAT rate of 19.2%. Egypt has a VAT rate of about 14%. South Africa, about 15%. And Mexico, somewhere in the order of about 16%. Our tax rate, VAT rate, stood at 5%, despite, of course, the increased activity in our midst. So that has been moved up to 7.5%. So the current VAT rate is 7.5%. We expect to see an uptick in revenues. But the Finance Act has also ensured that the increase in VAT rate does not impact the poor or so become a disincentive for small businesses in particular. So there's a whole exempted class of basic food items, and that's very comprehensively defined in the Act. All food necessities are not taxable, and the new Act also has 16 very clearly articulated classes of food. All are exempted from tax. Similarly exempted are services like drugs, locally manufactured sanitary towels, pads, and tuition fees in all tiers of the educational system, from nursery to primary. So there is no VAT on fees, no VAT on drugs, and a wide range of medical products. Also, as a palliative measure for micro and small enterprises, the VAT compliance threshold is now set at a turnover of 25 million naira. So if your company is recording a lower turnover than 25 million, you are not expected to register for that. So for small companies, they're exempted from tax, they're not obliged to register for VAT or render monthly returns for VAT. So that is the position with that. Also, services rendered by microfinance banks are exempted from VAT. And the reason why that is so is because the microfinance banks were trying to push between the BOI and the microfinance banks for greater lending to the trading sectors and also to small businesses. And so we need to remove that to enable that to happen. An upside of the VAT rate increase, which we must not fail to note, is that it will give the additional much-needed revenue to state governments as well. And this is a very important point because, of course, we've raised minimum wage now to 30,000. Many states, of course, complain that they cannot pay that easily. So with the increase in VAT rates, we expect that the state's capacity to pay will be enhanced. And just to explain how the VAT is shared, 50% of VAT goes to state governments, 35% goes to local governments, and 15% comes to the federal government. So states obviously have the lion's share of VAT proceeds. And the rate will increase. The rate will increase, of course, when you look at their own IGRs as well and all that. Now, governments need to focus, and many of our governments, of course, need to keep their focus on internally generated revenue. If you look at what happened, and there is absolutely no excuse, sometimes you hear about people talking about non-viable states. The reason why states are not generating as much as they should is because there is something coming from the federal government every month. If there was nothing coming from the federal government, states will pull their weight. If the federal government itself did not have all revenues, we will pull our weight. If you look at what happened in the regions, in the old regions, the northern region, the eastern region, the western region, all of these regions in that period not only paid all of their bills from internally generated revenue, tax, agriculture, mostly. They paid all their bills. In Western region, for example, they had free education, over 1 million pupils at one point in time. They built roads all over the place, and they were spending only 50% of what they generated and paying 50% to the federal government. And all they were relying on was essentially tax and agriculture. Just tax, that's income tax of individuals and agriculture. Today, that's no longer the case. Very few states, including the federal government, are as aggressive in revenue generation. We're not as aggressive because whether we work or not, something will come from federal allocation. And that's why there is a need to ensure that we hold ourselves to account for revenue generation. This country, a country of this size, certainly can do far more than we're generating at the moment. So, as I said earlier, it will enable governments to pay the new minimum wage so that they can play their key roles in the locational centers of economic activity. Let me also briefly mention the provisions on taxation of the digital economy and non-resident companies. This is a very important aspect of our taxation policy. Before the Finance Act, only companies that had a physical presence or a fixed base in Nigeria could be taxed. So most digital companies, any of the big technology companies, the multinational technology companies, do not have any physical presence in Nigeria. So they make significant income from Nigeria from online activities, such as advertising, movie streaming, online gaming, e-commerce, from subscribers in Nigeria, but they paid no tax whatsoever because they did not have a physical base in Nigeria. So now we are no longer relying on the fixed base or physical address criteria. Under the new act, once you have a significant economic presence in Nigeria, you are liable to tax, whether you are resident here or you are not resident as your company, so long as your economic presence is significant, you are liable to tax. So if you are streaming online or if all the adverts, Google advert, this advert and all of that, whether you are resident here or not, you are now subject to tax. So non-residents who previously had no fixed base and no Nigerian tax liability will now be taxed based on the significant economic presence criteria. So the minister, that's the Minister of Finance, has been empowered to issue a regulation defining what significant economic presence means. So she just defines the scope, what we will be looking out for in terms of significant economic presence. I think it's also important to note what the CBN has been doing to improve credit flow to the private sector. Now, it's very important to understand also the monetary policy issues, because the monetary policy issues determine what credit goes to the private sector. And as I mentioned earlier, the private sector is the focus of the economy. They are the job creators. So how do they get credit? And a major complaint of the private sector is that inability to access credit, cheap credit in particular. That's a major complaint. Everybody complains about access to credit. Now, The only way business can grow, of course, as as I pointed out, is loans to the real sector. But now, on account of the reform of the OMO operations, that's the open market operations of the central bank, we now have a situation where interest rates have become much lower. Now, also the loan-to-deposit rate is now 65%, but interest rates have become much lower. And the interest rates, especially for fixed, for fixed bills, for the treasury bills, etc., is now much lower. So you are looking at something in the order of between 3 and 6% or so for treasury bills, where it used to be 14%. Now, because of the lowering of the interest rates and the ban on Nigerian companies and banks and individuals investing in treasury bills, it is now apparent that they must now lend to the real sector. So because in the past, and I'm sure that many of us are familiar with this, in the past, banks, individuals simply invested in treasury bills, because treasury bills, you could get 14%, 15%, even higher, right, just by investing in treasury bills. So banks had no motivation whatsoever to lend to the private sector, because without any risk at all, they could earn anywhere from 14% upwards. But today, because they can no longer do so, they have the deposits. CRR is now at about 27.5, and because of that, they have enough resources to lend to the private sector. So they have cheaper funds with them, far cheaper funds. And it's very obvious from what we're seeing today that interest rates have dropped very sharply, and we're no longer going to have the rather excessive interest rates we used to have. But the target, of course, is to be able to bring interest rates to single digit. That's the target. At the moment, only our development finance institutions, such as the BOI, are able to offer those kinds of loans. So net domestic credit has increased by a little over 30%. And a further attempt to reduce the cost of doing business is, as I've said before, that reduction in fixed income yields, reduction in treasury bill rates. So government itself has an advantage. If you look at our debt burden today, most of our debt burden comes from servicing our debt. So we spend quite a bit of money servicing debt. Most of that debt is domestic debt. That means most of it is on paying back treasury bills. But when treasury bill rates were reduced to 5% to 6%, from about 14, it means that government itself pays far less to service its debts. So we're paying, considerably less. So the offshoot of this is that government will no longer be paying double-digit interest rates on treasury bills, and that reduces, as I've said, our debt burden, and it means that rates repayable on commercial paper will also not be high, so as to discourage investments. But I want to point out also the downside. The downside is that at the moment, current account balance is negative, and there's a need to improve foreign portfolio investment. But with low exchange rates, there is, of course, low foreign exchange flows. So when you have, one of the things that we want to achieve is to get foreign exchange flows, especially portfolio investments, in order to be able to boost our reserves. But if the interest rates are low, it of course means that we're less attractive as a destination for portfolio investment. That has its good sides, that has its bad side, but I choose to describe it as a downside because it means that we're going to see some reduction in foreign portfolio investment, at least in the short term. With the signing also of the deep offshore bill into law, we also expect enhanced revenues from the oil sector, and so enhanced revenues from the oil sector, of course, is another way of generating income. I'm going to stop about now. I think I've spent close to 40 minutes, but what I hope we'll be able to achieve, because I'm not done with the presentation, is that possibly when you're asking questions, I'll be able to devote a lot more time to social safety nets, to infrastructure development, etc. But meanwhile, let me spare you so that you can at least gather yourselves and be able to ask some questions. Thank you very much.